Thank you very much for being on the webinar today. My name is Chelsea Reinhardt. I'm the Standards Director for ASI, and this is the first spotlight session that we're holding during the open consultation on the ASI Standards Revision. And the topic today is to do a deeper dive into the circularity sections of the performance standard. Gabriel, next slide, please. So on the call today, along with myself, we have Gabriel Carmona Aparicio, who is our Circularity Research Manager. And we will start with a very brief overview of the standards revision process and scope. Not too much, as I know many of you may already be familiar with that project overview. Then I'll turn it over to Gabriel, who will take you sort of section by section through some of the key changes and the new content in the circularity sections of the revised performance standard. Then we'll highlight some of the priority areas for consultation input. So some of the ways that areas we've already identified to really encourage stakeholders to give input during the consultation, and also how to give your input and where to find more information and resources. And then we are expecting to have a good chunk of time at the end to take questions and have any discussion with you participants on the call today. So there is a chance really to ask questions, wrap your head around some of the material being presented, and hopefully have a much better understanding coming into the consultation process. Gabriel, next slide, please. Bit of housekeeping before we begin. First, a reminder of our antitrust compliance policy, which is available on our website. So no discussions around pricing, price premiums, or passing pricing on to customers, and any other topics of concern, not for today's call. Second, we want to acknowledge Indigenous peoples and their connections to the traditional lands where we and our members operate. We aim to respect the cultural heritage, the customs, and the beliefs of all Indigenous people, and to pay our respects to elders past and present. We are on Zoom today for the webinar session. So for those of you who haven't used it in a while, we are encouraging questions to come through the Q&A window, which you can either find at the bottom of your screen, or if it's not visible, click the little button that says More with 3 dots in it, and you should find the Q&A button there, and you can drag it onto your menu bar. If you do have questions during the session, please jot them down into that Q&A, and we will try and answer them either during the session if we can, or we'll hold them for the time at the end. All right, so a bit of an overview on where we got to and how we got to today's webinar. We are sort of midway through the standards revision at ASI. The scope of that revision includes the performance standard and the chain of custody standard. That is the performance standard version 4. That's the one under revision, the new version that's out for consultation. And it's version 3 of the chain of custody standard is the one out for consultation. We are expecting to also be revising and evolving the assurance framework, the claims guidance, and all the supporting guidance to those standards as well. Much of that work has started and will continue throughout the rest of this year into next year. But the main focus of this first consultation period is on those 2 draft standards. And that's really where your comments are most invited. The process of revision to date, the last year has really been spent together with extensive input from working groups, from thematic or technical experts, from the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, and underneath the guidance of the multi-stakeholder ASI Standards Committee, working on draft content, making changes, putting things out to pre-consultation, making more changes, and iterating. So a lot of eyes have been on these drafts already, and that has given us a pretty good sense of what some of those complex or controversial issues are, where we're really inclined to get a more broader set of feedback during this public consultation process. The current open public consultation process opened on the 17th of February and will run until 20th of April. So we're almost halfway into it. And that is the first of 2 public consultation periods that we will have during the revision. The finalized standards are expected to be released sometime in the second half of 2027. So it is a multi-year project, definitely a marathon, not a sprint. And I think a key message from that is that the drafts that are out to consultation now really are open to be shaped by your feedback. And you're likely to see still quite a lot of change between the drafts as they stand today and what we end up with towards the end of 2027. Next slide, Gabriel. Great. So before I turn it over to Gabriel to go into detail in the circularity section on criteria and requirements, just a few navigational points as you go in and have a look at these documents, because they will look and feel quite different from the current ASI Performance Standard version 3. So the first thing you'll notice is that the current version 3 sort of ESG principles have now been restructured, and the performance standard has 3 cross-cutting sections: governance, management systems, and responsible sourcing and due diligence. And those are sort of systems-focused areas that are cut across multiple different sustainability issues. On Thursday of this week, we do have a dedicated thematic session on responsible sourcing and due diligence, as well as chain of custody. And in that section 3 in the new standard really is everything to do with due diligence and responsible sourcing, also impacts really in the supply chain. We then have 5 thematic sections, so climate, nature, circularity, which has now been elevated into its own thematic or impact area, community rights and participation, and workers' rights and protections. And then on the right-hand side there, you'll see that we have 3 modular sections, and these are sets of requirements that have been pulled out of the main body of the performance standard, because although they are normative and they're part of the standard, they really apply only in very specific cases or specific contexts. And so they're there to be kind of consulted and applied as relevant. Next slide. And then just 3 points to highlight in terms of the structure of the criteria and requirements themselves. The first is that we have now made a distinction between requirements versus criteria. So conformance, whether or not an entity is fully conformant or has a minor nonconformance or a major nonconformance, will still be at the criterion level. That has not changed. However, instead of having narrative sections or paragraphs with lots of little subpoints all together, we've now separated out the supporting content into distinct requirements. And that's what you see here in the white 6.5.1.1, for example. And the aim of that kind of new structure is to promote better visibility into each sub-requirement so that they don't get lost or applied inconsistently by entities or by auditors. The second point to highlight is that we have now added in a new tier called leading practice. This is purely optional. If an entity wants to be able to make a claim of achieving leading practice in a specific thematic area like circularity, at the moment, the proposal is that you would need to demonstrate you meet 70% of those applicable leading practice requirements in the section. So under circularity, for example. That proposal is out there for consultation. So we have some questions specifically on whether or not that's a good approach or how that could be adjusted to better meet your needs. But just to reiterate, all the leading practice requirements, completely optional. And third, we have done quite a lot of work to embed a stronger concept of materiality and relevance throughout the standard. So in any given section, the majority of requirements will not apply to all entities. They might apply only to specific sections of the value chain where those impacts are most significant or most relevant. So please do pay attention to this applicability column, because you might be getting concerned about a requirement that feels less relevant or too difficult, and it might not apply for your type of entity. Next slide, Gabriel. And to help you with that, we have worked on an Excel-based mapping tool, which is available on the consultation website. We'll talk about it at the end, only just to highlight that this tool allows you to filter by applicability based on supply chain activity or whether you want to see minimum versus leading practice requirements. And then it will actually strike through the requirements that are not going to be applicable to you. So you can kind of see how that standard adapts based on applicability and supply chain activity. So really, hopefully quite a useful tool for you to use as you go through the drafts. All right. And that was a very quick overview of the project and the new structure. Now I'm going to turn it over to Gabriel to take you deeper inside those new circularity sections. Gabriel, over to you.
Thank you, Jesse, and hi, everyone. I start saying that today is a good moment to discuss circularity as we are celebrating World Recycling Day today. So hopefully we can cover all of the topics that are part of the version 4 of the standard. So now, in version 4, circularity has been expanded from a primarily aluminum specific, let's say, focus now into a broader circularity strategy. So basically, in section 6, where the main circularity requirement sits, we have circularity principles also appear in other sections, and not only in section 6. But today we're going to focus on several of those subsections that also cover circularity principles. For example, we have some link to nature through water recycling or mine closure through the recovery of material from infrastructures. And there's also a separate section on responsible sourcing of scrap, which will be discussed on Thursday with Chris and Marika. So you are invited to register for that webinar as well. So we're going to cover here the circularity aspects of circularity itself, nature, and mine closure and bauxite residue. Now, what is the structure of circularity in version 4? So we have section 6, which includes 8 subsections. And these cover the main areas where circularity can be addressed along the aluminum value chain. This one includes circularity strategy and performance, life cycle assessment, product and process design, aluminum process scrap, end-of-life aluminum containing products, spent pot lining, dross, and other high-impact resources. As I say, circularity is also linked to several other sections of the standards. So we have water recycling in the nature section. We have circularity mine closure and also circularity of bauxite residue. So it is important to know that not all circularity requirements apply to all entities. And as Chelsea was mentioning about the materiality of the different topics covered under the standard. So applicability depends on supply chain activity. So for example, product design requirements mainly apply to semi-fabricating and fabricating entities, while, for example, SPL requirements apply to smelters. So this is reflected in the colors that we use to characterize applicability in these slides. So, for example, there are 3 sections applicable to all entities in the value chain at both minimum and leading practices levels. And these are circularity strategy and performance, LCA, and process design. So let's say half of subsection 6.3. There is one subsection, which is called other high impact resources, 6.8, that only is applicable for those entities that want to reach a leading practices level for circularity. Now, and why the relevance of the applicability? So if we look upstream, these entities are responsible for a very large volume of residues. So we have bauxite residue, 115 to 200 million tons generated a year. If we look at overburden, the same quantity. So we're talking about per 1 ton of primary aluminum, we are generating 5 to 6 tons of resource outflows or byproducts, whatever term we're using depending on regulation. So that's the relevance of having those circularity criteria applied to upstream. Now, if we look downstream, for example, the ones highlighted in green, so circularity depends a lot on product design, as well as effective collection, sorting, and management of the scrap. So remember, for example, that at the moment we are generating 22 megatons of post-consumer scrap annually. And by 2050, we need to triple that number to 66 megaton to align with sector's climate target. So that's the relevance of having circularity criteria in our standards applicable to those downstream and recycling entities. Okay, so this slide includes a summary of all the main changes proposed in the circularity section. I will go through these different topics in the next slides, but having like an overall picture in this slide. So we have a lot of, let's say, like some new requirements at the minimum level. We have obviously several new requirements at the living practices level, but focusing on the minimum level. The draft introduces requirement for entities to establish a circularity strategy. So to account for resource inflow, to identify circularity risk and opportunities. There is also new requirements to review life cycle assessment at least every 5 years and update as needed. The draft also introduces a requirement to assess recycled content in major product lines. And this is to highlight the relevance of this metric without being very prescriptive about the methodology to use. It's more about the transparency of these assessments. Several areas have been clarified or expanded that we call major changes. So, for example, the classifications of resource outflows, it's more explicit, and product design requirements are now referred to clearly to circularity principles, such as reuse, recyclability, and disassembly. So at the moment, if we remember, we have mainly circular design, but open to any type of sustainability assessment, not necessarily linked to circularity. Now, sections now introduce optional leading practices. These are not required for certification, but they recognize more advanced practices. So examples include circularity action plans, a public disclosure of circularity performance. Let's remember that this version of the standard tries to highlight more outcome-based approaches and improvements, and particularly in the recovery of certain residues or resource outflows. Now, in terms of other points, the circularity section has also been substantially expanded to strengthen outcome-based approaches and align more closely with international circular economy framework. So the idea is to also, there have been a lot of new standards and principles released in the last 5 years, such as ISO 59004 or the ISO 59000 family of standards, the Global Circularity Protocol for Business, the ESRS-E5 for Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency on the CSDDD of the EU regulation. And one particular point where we're seeking feedback is whether cradle-to-grave LCAs for downstream entities should be included as a leading practice. But Chelsea will discuss how to give feedback on this revision at the end of this webinar. Now, let's look into the requirements and criteria applicable to all entities in this standard. So the first one is called Circularity Strategy and Performance. This first subsection focuses precisely on how to integrate circularity into the entity's strategy and also how to measure the circularity performance. This is a new subsection element and consider requirements above minimums and leading practices level. So the intention is to encourage entities to understand the material flows and integrate circularity into their management approach. Entities will commit to circularity through a sustainability policy or dedicated circularity policy. We include the reference to ISO 59004 for more information. They will also quantify the annual resource inflows linked to aluminium, alumina, or bauxite elements. So, as I say, it could be any aluminium or aluminium precursors, or also quantify other significant material inputs to the entities. Now, the entities should also quantify the different resource outflows. This is something that we at the moment have in the current version. We call the waste management quantification, but we're trying to change the approach. It's not only about waste, it's about resources. And why we use the term resources, because circularity is about how to add or measure or retain value of those flows. And that's why we're using that terminology. Obviously, depending where the entity is operating, that will also have to be aligned with and the legislation, the regulatory requirements. But that's the aim of this version of the standard, talking about resources, because resources have value. And as leading practices, entities could implement a circularity action plan with targets and priorities. And another leading practices are related to measuring and disclosing circularity performance, including circularity rate based on the amount of resources that are reused and recycled, and how they links to the inputs of the entities, but also other type of approaches to measuring circularity performance. So let's imagine if you have circularity business models, if you have circularity investments, if you have circularity collaborations with other partners in your value chain. So there are other ways that you can use to demonstrate circularity performance. Now, the second subsection is a life cycle assessment. In general, this is like it applies like we apply minor changes to that subsections. So we have two criteria: 6.2.1, which is related to assessing those impacts of major products lines where aluminum is a significant component. And we use a similar approach compared to version 3, where with those product lines are defined as those representing a substantial share of aluminum use. Now, in terms of the scope, it's also open to the use of cradle-to-gate or cradle-to-grave boundaries, depending on the context where the entity is sitting in the value chain. And we introduce a leading practice, which is how are we going to use those results to inform improvements in the performance of the activities, or even the purchasing activities, but several of those impacts that we consider that the entity measure as hotspots or significance are normally related to something that they're buying. It could be electricity or other materials. Now, the draft also is encouraging transparency. So in those for those entities that are communicating LCA results, the underlying assumptions and system boundaries should be accessible. This could be in private communications, let's imagine B2B communications in terms of LCA, or in public communication where other stakeholders can interpret the results of the entity. If they don't provide the assumptions, it could be let's say understated or overstated, depending on what the entity is communicating. Now, we include a requirement that LCA should be reviewed at least every 5 years. And as leading practices, entities could disclose LCA results in a third-party verified format. We also include the references for this. And another leading practices related to contribution of lifecycle inventory data to industry databases to support broader data availability. I think that's the general the aim of the LCA subsection. Now we have a new subsection which is called other high impact resources. I put that new in blue because it's only applicable to entities intended to achieve leading practices, and it's mostly to resources that are not already addressed elsewhere in the standard. So, for example, in the standard, we have a specific section for bauxite residue, SPL, dross. So other resources, or the different resources to these ones, can compare to the requirements in this subsection. And the idea is to encourage continuous improvements in how these materials are managed and valued and reincorporated within the entity or in other other entities. So as leading practices, entities could demonstrate the reductions in the generation intensity of these resources or increase the reuse, recycling, or repurposing relative to a baseline established by the entity. And another leading practice is developing plans to assess and potentially recover legacy materials. So this includes materials that were previously landfilled or stockpiled, but may now have recovery potential because technological improvements or new partnership with other organizations. As I said, the aim is to encourage long-term thinking about resource use and environmental liability. Now, let's look into the requirements that mainly apply to downstream and recycling entities, or those entities that have cow's houses. So specifically for downstream, including semi-fabricating and fabricating, we have the subsection on product and process design. Mainly, we have major changes in these subsections. Again, it's linked to products where aluminum is a significant component, and the idea is entity needs to integrate circularity objectives into product design and development. Examples include objectives related to durability, modularity, material efficiency, recyclability, or ease of disassembly. In cases where the entity does not control the design, and the expectation is to demonstrate effort to influence those design decisions where feasible. And the draft also introduced a requirement to provide guidance on end-of-life handling of the products, how the other entities or stakeholders in general can have accessible information of that end-of-life requirements. And finally, we have a new criteria. This one is applicable to all entities where circularity principles should be considered when designing a new or modifying a current process in a significant way. So the idea is to reduce material losses and make recovery of material easier. Okay. We have a subsection similar to version 3 on aluminum process scrap. I split these two main changes. So the criterion 6.41, which is about management of aluminum process scrap, basically have minor changes compared to the current version of the standards. The requirement is largely built on existing provisions, but basically we have some clarifications. So entities should minimize the generation of processed scrap. Where scrap is generated, it should segregate it by alloy type and grade where relevant. This is something that we have currently in the standard. I would say a bit more of a change is the third bullet, where we're establishing a number for the amount of aluminum processed scrap that needs to be collected and recycled by fabricating entities. Now, criterion 64.2 about recycled content transparency is completely new. And the idea is that entities should be able to assess the recycled content of major product lines, and the entities should be able to provide information about recycled content and the methodology used to calculate it when requested by commercial partners. That's again to make sure there's transparency in the information. And the people or entities that use that information have enough knowledge to conclude about the recycled content and how to use it. Now, there's a leading practices about public claims. So again, that those public claims could be or should be supported by third-party verification of that recycled content. As I say at the beginning, we're not prescriptive in terms of the methodology. It's more about the transparent use of that information. Now, 6.5 subsection about end of life of aluminum containing products. Minor changes compared to what we have in version 3. Basically, entities should define the role in that end-of-life recovery activities. And examples we provide there in terms of EPR, DRS, or the construction plans for those in the construction segments of the aluminum value chain. The entity should also engage with collection and recycling systems to help increase recycling rates in their markets, very similar to what we have at the moment. What we have, let's say, like more of a change is about leading practices for those entities trying to reach that level. So entities shall quantify and disclose their contribution to end-of-life collection systems. Or another leading practices is that entities shall set targets to increase the use of post-consumer scrap where technically feasible. Okay, and just pay attention to the time. Now, dross, again, minor changes. We already have a subsection in terms for dross in our current standard. In minor changes, we have two criteria in this subsection, and it's again about managing this resource outflow. The draft requires storage and handling practices that prevent release of dross, dust, or leachate to the environment, similar to what we have. The disposal should only occur in permitted engineered facilities designed to prevent contamination. Where dross residues are landfilled, entities should periodically review alternatives to landfilling. Now, in terms of, because we are talking about circularity, we have a requirement that entities should also implement processes to maximize the recovery of aluminum from dross, similar to what we have. But as a leading practice, we are trying to increase the proportion of recovered materials reintegrated into productions of other applications. So more like a outcome-based approach in that for that outflow. Now, looking into midstream, basically smelting, we have a subsection on SPL, minor changes compared to what we have at the moment in version 3. Now, what we're trying to focus on this SPS management is that the storage and management practices prevent environmental harm. This includes preventing release and restricting disposal to engineered facilities designed for treatment. In the discharge to water bodies is prohibited. We have that requirement at the moment. Entities should also review alternatives to landfilling or stockpiling of SPL. And we also have processes that should be implemented to recover carbon and refractory material from SPL. Probably we make that more explicit compared to what we have at the moment. And as leading practices, we are proposing that entities shall increase the proportion of SPL materials reintegrated into production or other applications. And again, similar, trying to have like an outcome-based approach. We're trying to kind of set some targets based on the entity's baseline. And also, we are promoting recovery of chemicals, so linked to SPL treatment and handling. So although they have like a lower volume compared to the SPL itself, still we consider that as a leading practice. Now, let's move into requirements for upstream and so basically mining and refining activities. So now in the nature section of the PS version 4 standard, on the nature, we have criteria linked to leading practices. That's what the new is in blue. So this doesn't apply to minimum requirements. So the idea is that the entities could develop strategies to increase water reuse and reduce fresh water withdrawals. This could include closed-loop recycling systems in productions or cooling processes. The strategy would also include measurable targets and monitor residues generated by recycling processes, because as we know, we can have a trade-off when we implement a good practice such as water recyclability, but then what are we going to do with that outflows generated by the process? And another leading practice is the public disclosure of water reuse volumes, both across all sites and specifically in water-stressed areas. Now, checking time here, we have a subsection in the mine closure module. 9.4 speaks about the integration of circularity principles in mine closure and rehabilitation, specifically at the planning level. So the draft proposes that the closure plans consider how materials and resources from the commission infrastructure could be recovered and reused. The plan could also include estimates of materials, quantities, and potential reuse options. And it should also consider a contamination risk and consult with affected communities about reuse opportunities. And finally, yes, when the infrastructure is transferred to communities, the draft specs feasibility assessment to ensure it does not become a long-term liability. And as leading practice, we also expect the entity to achieve 80% of materials from the commission infrastructure to be recovered for reuse or recycling. And finally, the subsection on bauxite residue circularity in the bauxite residue and tailings management module. So the draft introduces a requirement related to monitoring and publicly disclosing the amount of residue generated and the amount that is reused, recycled, and repurposed each year. And the temporary storage, they say, and disposal shall not be counted as reuse. And as a leading practice, entities could demonstrate either a reduction in residue generation or an increase in the proportion of reuse or recycle compared to the baseline. Again, link these to outcome base. I'm going to hand over to Chelsea for this section.
Thank you, Gabriel. That was quite a lot of content covered. And Gabriel, we've got a couple questions, one that's come through the chat to panelists and one through the Q&A. So I'll let you have a look at those while I go through some of the priority areas and how to give your input into the process. Next slide. So the point of today's session was really just to explain some of the proposed changes and tee them up for you to give your opinions during this next, little more than a month of open consultation period. We have different ways of giving input, and I'll take you through them in a moment, but you can see here some examples of these survey questions that focus on specific areas of the standard, where we actually have some options already proposed for you to give your input on. So as Gabriel mentioned, under section 6, one of the questions where we're particularly asking for feedback is about whether or not we should introduce cradle to grave LCAs as a leading practice requirement, specifically in that case for downstream or fabricating entities. So if you have an opinion on that, you can go ahead and let us know. And if you want to, you can explain your thinking there as well. We also are taking comments on anything in the section, whether it's detailed about wording of requirements or alignment with other standards or higher level comments on the overall approach. Next slide, Gabriel. So we have a dedicated hub, consultation hub. It's available at that link at the bottom, or you can get to it through our main ASI page or ASI standards page or via trusty Google search. Here you can download on the left all of the drafts in PDF form. They're also available in translated languages at those links below. And you can provide your feedback through two primary methods. Next slide. So those are via a dedicated SurveyMonkey link, also available in different languages. And here, there are a number of questions, but they're all optional, I think, except for location, which we are requiring. So if you don't feel comfortable putting your organizational name, you don't have to, although, of course, we encourage you to if you're willing. And you can select just the sections of the standard you want to comment on, and you'll just see questions for those sections. And here you also have the opportunity to put in free text comments, but that does allow us to aggregate feedback on specific areas of concern or issues that we know in pre-consultation have been a bit contentious across different stakeholders. Or you can download this Excel feedback form, which allows you to select a specific requirement, criterion, or a section. The text will pop up on the right, so you make sure you're putting your comment against the correct section, and then you can add in a free text comment. You know, looks great, would like to see this adjusted, please consider my comment XYZ. And we will be going through all of those individual comments received. If neither of those work for you, you can send us a direct email to that consultation@aluminiumstewardship.org email, but it does help us to aggregate the feedback if you are able to use one of those two methods. Next slide. And to help with understanding the changes, we have a summary PowerPoint. We also have a short video explainer, and we have the Excel-based mapping tool, which I mentioned earlier. Those are all available in the Consultation Hub and can be downloaded and used. If you have any questions on them, anything's not working, you have suggestions for improvement, you can drop us an email at that consultation address as well. We will get back to you very quickly. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a list of webinars. Some of these are no longer upcoming, but the ones that have already happened, you can watch the recording and the link should be available on that page as well. So we had two high-level kind of overall launch webinars that went into much more detail on some of those structural changes that we sort of blitzed through at the beginning. We had a Chinese specific session. We've got this one. We have a spotlight on responsible sourcing and chain of custody on Thursday. And then next week, we'll have two sessions on changes under the climate section. So please do register or watch the recording. And with that, we've got just under 15 minutes. I think we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Chelsea. So we have got a couple questions so far, and allow me to answer some of them. So the first one is from Kathleen. It says that for life cycle assessment, is it enough to meet ASI requirement when you only evaluate the global warming potential of your aluminium products? So I would say the short answer is no. If you read the requirement, it says evaluate the life cycle environmental impacts. So it's a plural. So you should measure more than a global warming potential. And how to select other impact categories, it's up to the entity. Obviously, we are using ISO 14040 and 14044 as reference here, but also depending on the product, there are already other standards that are used, for example, in the construction sector or automotive sector, to include other impact categories. So yes, look into your product, what it's relevant, and we should measure more than CO2.
Gabriel, just a quick note on that one. Just to say that we haven't, in this version that's out for consultation, you'll notice that there is some sort of short explanatory notes that have been published together with the materials, but we don't have detailed guidance yet out for consultation. And the aim is to be building that guidance throughout 2026 and into next year. But you can refer to some of that existing guidance around LCA criterion in version 3, which is quite explicit that it needs to be beyond just the climate impacts or the global warming potential. And likely some of that guidance will be carried through for consistency into this version 4 as well.
Thank you, Chelsea. We have another question about a leading practice 6116 references the mitigation hierarchy. Is there a universally accepted hierarchy, or are we using our own developed one? So I think this is a leading practice. We are trying to align with international standards. So I would say at the moment, yes, there is one. If we look into ISO 15004, they're providing for, because we're talking about circularity, they already providing a hierarchy. Now, when we develop the guidance tools for our members, we will be more explicit about how to address this hierarchy. But I think the main intention is to highlight how the entity is prioritizing prevention over landfilling or final disposition. So I think that's the reason behind that that requirement. If you can demonstrate that you have exhausted all your technical and financial options for prevention before jumping into reusability, recyclability, and then landfilling or incinerating even, then you can demonstrate alignment with that requirement.
Any final questions or clarification points before we close for today? If you do go and read the drafts and something comes to your attention or isn't clear, or you have a query, you can always send either direct email to Gabriel or myself, or you can send us a query to the consultation at aluminiumstewardship.org email address, and we will get back to you on that directly. And otherwise, yes, please do get active and give us your feedback. It's really important to make sure that we end up with a standard that works for all core stakeholders in the aluminium value chain. So thank you very much for for your time today and for the attention and the questions. And we look forward to hearing from you.